Welcome to On to Islam and the Becoming Muslim podcast. In this episode, host Christen Amer explores the ideas of what it means to be a man in Islamic society. Throughout the episode, the ideas of what it means to be masculine are defined and stereotypes challenged. If you are a new revert or even a born Muslim, struggling with what it means to be a strong Muslim man, you will find the advice given by our guest Nawal beneficial through her years of experience in studying Islam and public health. Your role in creating a just and merciful society is truly pivotal and definitely worth the time and effort in exploring.
Assalamu alaikum, dear listeners. Inshallah, today's show is about how to be the best Muslim man you can be. This is useful for any Muslim man, but we are specifically keeping in mind those who have newly reverted, who may be struggling with their male identity within Islam. As with all matters, it is best to try to engage with the Quran and Sunnah without any cultural or social baggage. In that vein, we are honored to have Nawal Ali here to help identify the characteristics of an ideal Muslim man and the pivotal role he has in making a better society. This is Nawal's third time on the show. Nawal currently lives in Montenegro and is a public health specialist who has mastered 5 languages, Arabic among them, and has studied Islam extensively. Welcome to the show, Nawal. It is always a pleasure to speak with you.
Alaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
Oh, yeah. We really enjoy the wisdom that you have to share with the listeners. So the idea for this show actually stemmed out of a conversation of concern for the men who you have witnessed, either through counseling or in your personal life, struggling within the confines of what society has deemed to be masculine. What are the most common ideas or problematic expectations that were set for these men?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately, there's a problem in both the Muslim community and the non-Muslim community of men wanting to prove themselves as masculine figures. And therefore, you see that being reflected where you have both women in both societies actually talking about the issues that they have with men. So personally, as a Muslim woman, I have witnessed a lot of issues with abuse, with cheating, with adultery, et cetera, or just generally even using religion to justify their actions in my own Muslim community. And it really does stem from the fact that a lot of these men are very culturally attached to their identity as men, instead of, looking at what Islam asked them to be as Muslim men. Of course, in the non-Muslim community, there's something very similar as well, where you find men are very culturally attached to their identities within the confines of their society. So what I can say is that there's a lot of different things which I started noticing on both ends. And most of them, they kind of fall into some sort of, something usually sexual. So there's kind of this need to prove yourself sexually or more physically. And of course, you also have the emotional and the mental aspects as well there. But generally, the themes that I have consistently noticed are in those 3 categories. And it's not just with it's not just with women generally. It's also amongst their own, their own friends or their own brothers or, other male figures around as well, that there's this consistent need to be something based on what other men want them to be.
So when we talk about this in psychology today, they usually use this term toxic masculinity. Can you define for us what toxic masculinity is?
Yeah, I think toxic masculinity, it really stems from this idea of, you know, not being secure within yourself of what is a man, but rather trying to prove yourself as a man. So every society has a different expectation. For example, the country that I live in now, Montenegro, there is a common issue of adultery in this country, and it's really rampant, unfortunately, because, you know, from a young age, many young boys are told that a man is someone who is very promiscuous, who goes out and sleeps with a lot of women. And unfortunately, this kind of bleeds into their lives even after they're married. So you find that there's a lot of issues with adultery in this country. Um, you know, for other cultures, it might be related to, you know, showing their dominance within a system. So I previously actually discussed with you, Kristen, about the military, that in the U.S. Military, I was recently looking into the statistics of the system where women are basically joining the military and how many of them are actually getting to where they want to be. And upon researching this concept, I started finding that actually 1 in 4 women are raped in the military, and that's with 70% going unreported. And there's been a huge, there's actually a documentary that came out recently. It's called Invisible War, where it talks about even the contract that you sign to join the military has so many vague clauses basically saying that we are not responsible if something like this happens. And time again, a lot of women have complained about getting raped or getting, you know, sexually harassed, and the military refuses to do anything about it. And so this is a different type of, you know, toxic masculinity, which you're seeing in a first world country, you know, where people would expect that women would have their rights, and yet, you know, in a system where the law is not dominated by a civil court, you're finding that they're taking advantage of women in this type of way where, you know, they might be secretly doing things towards them and they're completely fine with it, because it's a system which really emphasizes being a man, both, you know, but more in a physical way, because in that case, of course, rape is more about power. So you're finding that these themes are common in every society. And unfortunately, they are really dominated by the culture and what the cultural expectation is. There's very few places where you will find people having a very peaceful relationship with women. And, you know, so therefore, I find that toxic masculinity is just this need of proving yourself to be a man. And it comes on, you know, it comes at the account of hurting anyone that you have to kind of get there, but also being very insecure with yourself, because there shouldn't have to be this inner change to be a man, in a negative way, I mean.
Right. So toxic masculinity is a system of learned false beliefs about what it means to be a man. Whereas
Yeah.
the nature of a man when he is born is beautiful. We are told this in Islam. The nature of men and women, we have a pure soul and a pure mind, and we're only made different from our environment or our upbringing. So it's not, we want to make sure it's not a natural flaw in men. This isn't what they're designed to be or do, but it's rather something that's put upon them subconsciously even. They might be doing this in their personal lives where they think, they're doing the best or they're being the best man they can be. But these things are kind of ubiquitous and sinking in subconsciously and affecting their relationships with the women in their lives and the men, and they don't even know.
Yeah, I mean, it's not always even women related because, for example, in England, I know that there's a huge culture on getting drunk and getting just completely smashed. And that's also just another form of toxic masculinity, of being able to prove that you can drink that much, that you can handle that much. And, as I said, every culture has something like that. Every culture has this kind of theme of, proving yourself as a man. So maybe, I mean, like in the Middle East, I've noticed a lot of that relates to, the man having the last word. I mean, that's also a form of toxic masculinity where, even if your wife has a good opinion, you have to just prove that you're the man of the house, or maybe not even. In some houses I've seen where the men are not really willing to help out in the house because they believe that it makes them too feminine. So it's not just, restrained to how you treat women, but even just how you interact with the rest of the world. So, your male friends or, your children, your relatives, whoever. And it's really interesting because you would expect that this would not be such a problem, considering that, every man has a mother figure in their life, and a father figure in their life, and you would assume that there wouldn't be this need to be that way, but unfortunately, the society really does shape you. So I've seen, people who have really great parents who don't embody any of those attributes, and yet you see that very easily the society, pulls you in and has these expectations. It's really unfortunate, but I know actually some brothers here where I live who have actually said that they cannot find women to get married to because this society emphasizes so much on being a man and being tough and being almost like abusive. I mean, Montenegro has actually one of the highest rates of domestic abuse in this region. And unfortunately, I've seen it myself where a woman has seen, a brother that I might know and asked me, oh, is he homosexual? Only because he's so willing to help out or, be very gentle towards women. And so you see how even though that brother, maybe he grew up in a house where his mother taught him to be gentle and caring towards women, but the society is pushing him towards being this toxic, negative person.
Right. And oftentimes, I know you said you had some experience in counseling. They know that this is the case, so they have this kind of internal struggle within themselves, and then this might spill out into outward behaviors like the binge drinking will help take that edge off where they don't need to think about that.
Yeah,
But
I mean, I've had a brother who I didn't counsel him, but he was someone I knew, and he asked me once about generally, relationships as a woman, as a Muslim woman, and how I handled, basically resisting certain types of outside influences and things like that. And I was talking to him and he told me that he regretted his childhood so much. Or not his childhood, sorry, his like early years of in his 20s so much because he cheated on so many women. And he told me, I lost the chance to be with a good woman in my life because I cheated so much. And now I'm 30, he's 38 now. And he said, I can't find a good partner because all the good women are taken, and it's really hard for me to find someone. And I regret all my actions because it was so, it was based on everyone telling me that a man is someone who sleeps around and really just looks out for himself. And so, alhamdulillah, I'm happy that he's changed now and he's really trying to change his life now. But, that feeling of, he mentioned to me, I had so many women who didn't deserve that. And they were really good women. And I just, I caused heartbreak for no reason. So, it becomes a very vicious cycle. And I think within yourself as well, because now, alhamdulillah, he is in a relationship. And he told me even now, it's just like a consistent temptation to just cheat on his partner and do, something outside because, once again, as I mentioned, he's not a Muslim brother, but he was saying that the society really pushes for him as a man that even when he's married to be having relationships outside of his marriage.
Right. So then how does becoming a Muslim free you from these kinds of toxic ideas that either society or your upbringing have instilled within you?
Yeah, so Islam actually really tried to erase this type of mentality from men. So what I really love is that we always admit and recognize that there are differences between men and women. Islam doesn't ever say men and women are the same physically, because that's not the truth, right? We have differences physically. Women are more internal and men are more external. But when we look back on hadith, when we look back on, ayahs from the Quran, it always talks about women and men being equal on the scale of, their deeds. And that's such an important thing to mention, that there was no, blame on either sex for being the way that they are, that Allah actually says, you're equal in my eyes, but physically you're different. But he also mentions, but you complete each other. And that's the main key, because I think for many people, they're like, well, I'm a man, I'm stronger, I have more dominance, and you're lesser than me. But what Allah actually talks about is we complete each other, that women bring something to the table and men bring something to the table. As far as the concept of toxic masculinity, this is a concept that also existed during the Prophet ﷺ's time, where you had men, marrying more than one woman, but actually not like really treating them so well. You had the concept of, women being buried at birth just for being a woman. Baby girls being buried just because they were girls. And you also read about the consistent abuse and objectification of women, which was happening even then. And when the Prophet ﷺ came, it's interesting because he was a very gentle figure, even before he became the Prophet. And yet he also had a lot of masculine traits, or what I should say, masculine in comparison to what they wanted for his time, because he was, mashallah, a wonderful husband and father to his family, to his children. But he was also a great, military leader. He also knew how to be a man at the times when he was required to be a man. So I think with Islam, when you become a Muslim and you start entering into into these stories and you start, looking at all the ayahs in the Quran and everything, you need to really recognize that for, what I find interesting is like for women, Islam really emphasizes the external things, about her rights to own land, her rights to, for example, pick the partner that she wants, and all of these external concepts. But for men, Islam talks a lot about the internal aspects. And I believe it's truly because as much as men and women, they complete each other, but also the strengths of the opposite sex really help to strengthen each person. So for women, they need more of the physical aspects in their life to be stronger women, to be able to survive, to be able to be stronger as women in their society. Whereas men, they need more of the internal things. So, they need to learn how to access their internal softness, their feelings, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Islam really promotes that. It talks about, vulnerability. It talks about how the man who is the strongest is the one who is the kindest to women. And it emphasizes that strength it's not external, it's also internal. So I think when you become Muslim, it's really important to recognize that as a man, those concepts are really important to you being a better Muslim man.
Right, and this is actually called our greater jihad in Islam for both men and women, that we need to struggle against ourselves or our egos, which can be built up by the society or again our environment that we were raised in. And take the example that the Prophet, peace be upon him, gave us to be the best Muslims we can be, and also in conjunction with the ayah of the Quran, and also the general themes that the Quran has throughout it, which are justice and mercy and gentleness and kindness towards everybody in society, including all the way down to the animals and the trees and the universe as a whole.
And so I think it's even interesting when you talk about, when you're talking about that about jihad, personal jihad, because in Islam, the personal jihad for a woman is to be able to, on the outside cover herself from basically being sexually abused, or even just, harassed or whatever it may be. We've already talked about, hijab before, but I think it's really interesting that women have this kind of this concept basically being talked about in Islam for them, whereas with men, when it talks about their own jihad, it's more internal, as far as internally protecting themselves from sexual temptation. So it's really interesting that even in those concepts, for men, it's more internal, and for women, it is more external. And I just wanted to mention as well is that, unfortunately, even amongst Muslim societies, it's really easy to use information to justify that toxic masculinity. And I've seen this over and over again, especially, I grew up in an immigrant, community. And a lot of these men, they felt ashamed to, give up any type of power to the women in their household or to help out or anything. And so they justified it by saying, oh, in Islam, like men are the providers and women are supposed to be at home. And that's not really true because, yes, okay, women are supposed to take care of the children. Men are supposed to provide, but also the Prophet ﷺ, he always helped at home. He always, it says that he would wash his own clothes, sew his own clothes. He would, help out as much as he could. He took care of the children. And I think, the problem is that when you mix culture with religion, then you lose sight of those things. So right now, at least, I find that the personal jihad of most men within the Muslim society is to really ask themselves when they have those feelings, when they have those ideas of like, oh, this is the way it should be, and this is the way it shouldn't be, and this is what I want, and this is what I don't want, to really ask themselves where this is coming from. Because I find a lot of the times these ideas are coming from a previous influence in their life or a cultural aspect that's really dominating into their life. And that's, I think, something really hard for men to do since they're so detached from a young age from their feelings due to a lack of good male figures. But it is something that unfortunately is a really big problem in the Muslim society, where you find women are feeling very abused, very, mistreated due to men who have these kind of these types of concepts, and it has drastic effects on the society as a whole, where you have Muslim women leaving, you have some women who are just like, I don't want to get married anymore, or I'd rather get married to someone outside of this community, and you start noticing it does really become a problem. Yeah, so you have this has a really big effect on the society, where you have women who want to leave the community, or they they decide that they want to get married outside of the community, or they don't want to get married at all. And the thing is that I don't want to turn this into a blame game where it's all on the men, because it's not true. There's issues from both ends, but I think it is a problem that I've seen, growing up in my own youth. I saw that consistently, where, if a woman came out and said, I have like a father who's sexually abusing me, or I have a relative who's doing this or that to me, it was always kind of, instead of viewing that woman as a victim and actually trying to understand what the problem was, it would always turn into, she shouldn't have mentioned that in the first place. This is like a honor thing for the family. And now the family has been disgraced, the father has been disgraced. And it just would turn into this very vicious cycle where all that anger would be taken out on the woman, rather than it being, addressed and dealt with fairly.
Right. And so this is something that goes completely counter to Islam and the Prophet, peace be upon him, example. And you had been mentioning about women going out in society, or their main role being at home, when actually this was a complete opposite role that Khadija had taken, who was the Prophet's first wife. Is that correct?
Yes, she was a businesswoman, and she was much older than him as well. When you read, I think she was 40 and he was 25. So when he married her, he really married her with the idea of, this is a person I truly love and admire and I look up to, because she was stable. She was, she had her life built, and, he really admired her for the woman she was. He didn't marry her for beauty. He didn't marry her because, oh, she's younger than me and I want to be with a younger woman. I mean, there was none of that. It was just a very pure intention. And even after she died and he married other women, he consistently talked about how much he missed her and how much he loved her and how she was such a great supporter in his life.
So I think that's a fantastic example of the sexes helping each other to strengthen in the things which they may struggle with personally due to their genders. So, along this vein, and thinking about the Prophet in the Quran, do you have a hadith or a couple hadiths or a Quranic verse that you feel really summarizes what the ideal Muslim man should embody?
Yeah, I think the best hadith I could think of is that a strong, there's a hadith that says something like a strong man is not one who shows his strength physically, but one who can control his anger. And it talks about, I think that to me, that hadith in itself just tells me how important it is for a man to be very internally connected to himself. I feel like there's another one as well that talks about, the best among you is the one who is the kindest to women. And then you have so many others as well where the Prophet consistently talks about why he loves women, not in a sexual way, but about about the natural tendencies that women have and characters that women has, where he talks about, he loves that they like to smell nice. He loves that they, are very clean, and they really emphasize, like hygienic adab, just where they really focus on being clean on the inside and soft and gentle. And he consistently talks about that and talks about those attributes. What I find really interesting amongst all of these hadith is also the idea of, for example, there's a story of Ali wanting to marry the daughter, I think it was the daughter of Abu Sufyan. And when when Fatima found out the Prophet ﷺ's daughter, she was really upset about it. And I guess she told her father. And the Prophet ﷺ, he spoke to Ali and he just said, listen, if you decide that you're going to marry her, Abu Sufyan's daughter, you're welcome to do that, but you only do it on the account of divorcing Fatima, because I don't want her to get hurt in this. And I think, I've heard this hadith in so many different ways. And I've heard people say, oh, it's because it was the enemy's daughter. I've heard it's because of this, it's because of that. But I really do feel like the way it was worded, the way he talks about, about his daughter being upset about it, to me just showed how much he really cared about her feelings. So even though Islam allowed for polygamy, but he basically told Ali, when you're with my daughter, and that she's not happy with something like that, I can't see her be in pain. So even as a father, he was defending her. And I do know that from the story of Ali, that he never married a second woman until after her death. So I mean, that to me just says so much about how the Prophet ﷺ really talked about. I'm not talking about the concept of polygamy, but about caring about the feelings of the women in his life. It wasn't just like, oh, she's a woman who cares, like, let's just do this. He actually really gave a lot of, he acknowledged their feelings, and he was always there for his daughters. And he, when you read his story, he consistently focuses on the love that he had for his daughters and how he treated them, how he treated his wives. And so I think, there's a lot of hadith and a lot of ayahs that can discuss, the attitudes towards women in Islam. But I think just reading his story in itself will give you a very clear idea. And even just reading in the Quran that, in Allah's eyes, we're equal. And that with everything, the fact that I know for people now, they don't really understand why it was so revolutionary for women to have inheritance, and what in the Quran, for example, or in that time. But actually, it really was, because women didn't get inheritance at that time. They didn't get, they didn't get certain rights that women have now. And so, for me, when I view the Quran, I don't view it as because I know some people have said, well, why do women get less of an inheritance? And I think it's really important to recognize that in that society, it was just like zero for women. So the Quran in itself, all the things that it talks about, the rights that it gives women and everything, of course, if you live in a society where women get half, that's great. There's no problem with that. Quran doesn't go against that. But I think it's important to remember that a lot of the rules that are in the Quran, those rules were starting from zero, meaning that women had nothing before that. So I think even just that in itself is enough for me to understand that Islam really promotes the rights of women, and it really takes away from this idea of men having everything and having power over everything, and that it's just their way or the highway.
Right,
So
and kind of
go ahead.
sorry not to interrupt you, but I don't want to lose the train of thought here. And kind of to piggyback off of this idea and to stress the importance of that hadith that you mentioned, where Fatima's husband was told not to marry another man in consideration of her feelings. You know, for the Prophet, peace be upon him, to suggest that it was either divorcing, which is, we know, we're told, is something that is the most hated permissible thing in Allah's eyes, or to just stay married only to Fatima, it's a very powerful thing when considering, you know, the man's decision making process within the broader context as well. So I think what you're emphasizing here is for Muslim men, their power actually comes from also empowering the women in their lives, for
Yes.
acknowledging, you know, that there is this equilibrium or balance or justice and mercy that needs to be maintained between the sexes in order for the whole society to thrive.
Yeah. And that's why I mentioned that the Quran, it started from zero. You
Right.
started from zero, and then all of a sudden, Islam allowed for women to have all of these things. So,
Hmm.
just to show that, men were not the only ones there, that there needed to be care for this other gender as well.
Right.
Um,
And
so
I
I
know,
think,
oh, sorry.
no, go
I know
ahead.
you had mentioned for example, the housework being majoritarily on the women in Muslim society. But I think this is also a paradigm that we have in the West, and generally across the globe, since, you know, a woman's place traditionally has been at home. Um, so I just wanted to interject that, you know, it's not only in Muslim society that we find this problem. It's also in broader society, where even when a woman is, like, for instance, in America, when a woman goes out to work here and both partners are working, still a lot of the time we find that the majority of the housework will fall on her.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why I said it is an issue everywhere. And it's not about feminism. It's not about, I know, because a lot of people feel that way, like, oh, you're being so overly feministic. It's not about that, but it's really about, acknowledging that, um like acknowledging that, we, even, I think now, to be a housewife, it's even harder because you don't really have anyone helping you at home, whereas in previous societies you did. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that your wife has, these, like, these different issues to also deal with, because I think for a lot of men, they're like, I don't understand, like, she gets to sit at home and relax. Like, no, that's not really how it works. She has children to take care of. She has a lot of, like, cooking and cleaning and all those things to do as well. And I think as you age, it does become harder and harder. There's no end to any of that. If you're a housewife, especially, that's what you have to do for the rest of your life. It's not like at 60, I'm retired and I'm checked out now. So it's important to recognize that you also have a role in that house to help out, to also give. And it's not so easy to be a mother, and to be just a housewife, unlike what a lot of people think.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about some general themes and broader ideas about what a Muslim man should look like. So let's delve into the practicalities of a Muslim man in his family life, for example. What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think, as far as being a Muslim man in your family, we see that the Prophet ﷺ did emphasize, as I mentioned before, cleaning up after himself, sewing his clothes, fixing his own things, whatever. And so you see that he was very active in the house with contributing and kind of taking care of his own things, and not consistently asking his wives to do those things. You also see that he was an amazing father figure. He had, mashallah, was it 4 daughters? And he was very active in their lives, where he was consistently, there for them. He was talking to them, really engaged with them. Unlike, unfortunately, now, where you see a lot of men don't really give too much attention to their children. You also see that he was always there to listen to his wives and really help them get through, whatever they were going through, and be there to listen to them. So it's important to recognize all those things in his character, and how, he was, even though he was, also a military leader, but he was also very actively engaged in his household, both emotionally and physically. It even talks about, there's hadith that even talk about how a man, a man who really, cares, he's also there to, he doesn't just care about himself sexually, but he also cares about the needs of his wife. And that's, I think, a problem that does exist until now, where you have men who are very selfish about their own sexual needs, but not about the sexual needs of the women that they're with. Other than that, though, what I can say is just that you just see that he wasn't just coming into the house and just saying, hey, I'm the leader of everything. I mean, financially and everything else, he really viewed his wives as his supporters. And I think for a Muslim man, it's really important to view your wife as your supporter in your household, or even in some cases where women are the breadwinners, to even view them as someone who is actually leading the house on those decisions. And understand that your masculinity comes from treating them well and giving them the same things that you would really want for yourself as well. Islam does emphasize men are the protectors of women, and I think a lot of people take that as, oh, I have all the power, but it doesn't say that you rule over women. It says you're the protectors. And it specifically mentions that because men are physically stronger and they have the capability to defend their women physically much more than a woman would be able to defend herself. So it's important to understand that as a protector, it means that if your family is physically in trouble, that you're there for them. But that doesn't mean that you can abuse your power.
Right. So it has a different connotation than a ruler. When we say protector, we mean this in a positive way. So I think that's a very important thing to note. And you had been talking about the Prophet, peace be upon him, in terms of his military career. And I think this is something also that we should touch on to kind of get the broader societal view of how a man should act within the society, and even within warfare. I think we can garner some very fantastic lessons about what it means to be a Muslim man. So do you have some examples from that?
Yeah, I think generally in society, some of the same elements apply, right? That, now that women and men are working together very, in very close proximity to each other, you're dealing with kind of almost the same issues that you're dealing with your wives or the women in your household. And I think it is important, in society to be there for women, at least nowadays. So as I mentioned before, I was mentioning the military, that you have these types of cases of like rape and harassment and whatnot. And I've seen these cases happen even outside of the military context. And it's important to, as a man, voice your, like, to basically voice your support for these types of on these types of issues, because unfortunately it is still very common. And I saw this specifically actually in the masjid, where I was seeing women who had gone through rape or some kind of physical abuse in their relationships. And I found that rather than their brothers, both Muslim brothers and their actual brothers, supporting them and being like, I don't want to see my sister go through this, or no woman in our community should ever have to go through this. I would find that oftentimes they would be like, she needs to deal with it. And that was just the end of the conversation. And the blame was just put always on her. So, of course, in a workplace, maybe you might not have to deal with physical abuse as much, but, there's still other concepts where, a woman is, maybe all the hard work she put in is taken advantage of, or, where she's harassed, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in a broader, in the society on a broader scale, men have the duty of also being in some way supporters, but also protectors of women. And as I said,
Right.
protector is really, emphasized, because I think for many people they view it like, okay, I have, I can have my opinion, just, overrule any other, and like a woman's opinion because I'm a man, and that's not the truth.
Right.
It's more of like, you're there to support and be there as someone who really cares for this woman as your sister.
You're right.
So I think that's the biggest thing that I could say of being a man and being a Muslim man in society, is that just recognizing your role with other women, it's as a protector and not as a ruler. And as far as other men, I should also mention this, like with other men, it's also your duty to really not feel ashamed of being the person that you are, and also emphasizing those characteristics of our strength is not in being, oppressive bullies, but actually being intact with ourselves. And I do find that this is a problem amongst men until now, where they can't let their guard down. And I have heard from men, I've heard from men on a personal basis that they couldn't, I know, like, I'll just give an example. I know one brother, he was raised by his mother. His father was not a part of his life. And he told me that, when he's around men, he doesn't feel like he could be himself, because if he ever mentions, for example, I don't like watching pornography, or I don't, Or he said, when I hang out with men and they're talking about women, who are walking down the street, he said, as much shame and, anger I feel towards these men for talking about women in that way, I can't really voice it because it's an embarrassment that I, as a man, don't feel that way. And he talked about why he specifically felt that way, because he was raised with a single mother, and also, like, mashallah, he was the only man in his family, actually, from amongst the children. He said, all my cousins are girls, actually. So he had a lot of contact with women, and somehow he became very close to his internal self through that experience.
Right.
But in a society where he can't really voice that, it's a problem. But I think it is really important to, as a man, voice that this is wrong and we shouldn't be this way, and that
So
there
that it
is
becomes,
something.
sorry, didn't mean to cut you off, but so that it becomes the norm, so that
Yeah.
other men feel more comfortable, so that then this is getting the ball rolling in that direction where it's okay to voice your emotions. It doesn't make me stronger to put women down, kind of, well, the toxic masculinity that we were talking about. That's not
Yeah.
what it is to be a strong man in general. And so I wanted to circle back because you had mentioned before when we were talking about this, such a beautiful hadith about the way in which the Prophet Muhammad would, peace be upon him, would advance in warfare. Do you know which hadith I'm talking about?
Not specifically, but go
Not
ahead.
like not cutting down the trees, and you
Oh,
had
yes,
mentioned,
yes.
yes, this hadith. So I think it would be really important to mention this hadith in the context of the broader role that a Muslim man plays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that hadith really shows the nature of Islam. So there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ is mentioning that in war we don't hurt the women or the children, and we don't cut down the trees. And if you really think about that and you really try to understand why he said those things, it's number one, war is already brutal. It's already very difficult. And you see this now that when soldiers go into a region, there are issues with rape, with murdering of children, and it's just, innocent blood being shed, and just, abuse of the weak. And what it ends up causing is a long-term effect of psychological issues, which can last for generations. So for me, when I read that hadith, it basically tells me that we're forbidden to do that. First off, so that society after the war can thrive again, and that includes the not cutting down vegetation or trees, because they need those things to survive. And of course, trees are also alive, so we're not supposed to hurt them in warfare. But there's so much respect as well in war, and it mentions in Islam, like, we're not allowed to mutilate the bodies. That when we send the bodies back, we send them back with, just basically a clean cut, let's say. Not with, the face being deformed, or, them cutting off, parts of the body or anything like that. And there's a lot of hadith talking about, Sahaba who had that done to them in war, and how much the Prophet ﷺ was so affected by this. But, there has to be dignity in war, and there has to be some kind of respect, because that's where the bond or the peace of that society it's going to only be possible if you show respect towards the other side. So even though it's a war, but at least, just think about that. Like, if you're sending back bodies completely mutilated, there's no chance of that society ever wanting to be at peace with you. Whereas if you're sending it back where like, okay, they consented to this war, we consented to this war, whoever was killed, but now we hashed it out and we would like to have like a peace offering, it's much more possible. But the main thing that that we're talking about here is that, a part of that respect comes from not hurting the innocent elements of this war, which is, the women, the children, and the trees. That there has to be, it doesn't make you a man to go into a region and just rape women or kill children. It actually makes you a man to say, I'm not going to hurt them because they're not a part of this fight. Because oftentimes that urge to hurt women and children, it's a power thing. And it becomes very addictive, very easily. And I think I mentioned this to you as well before that, when they were doing a study on veterans coming back from the Iraq war, they talked about one of the reasons why they couldn't bounce back to normal society and get jobs and live normally was because they said that they felt this urge to feel the same power that they felt when they killed people overseas, and how addictive that feeling became. I mean, one guy mentioned that it was better than the feeling of taking actual drugs, that he felt so powerful, and so it was just a very addictive feeling. And that was a big reason why, they also mentioned in the study, that's a big reason why a lot of men who do come back from the war, they often resort to playing video games or watching war movies where they can relive that feeling. So I think it's important to highlight that how much of a psychological effect it can have on not only the psyche of the person who's killing, where, it becomes this thing, because, when you feel like the other side is equal to you, and, if I have the same equal chance of hurting them as they have of hurting me, I think it really feels real to you, but when you have that feeling of I can destroy something that's weaker than me, I think it becomes a kind of ugly obsession of some sort. And that's normal. I mean, humans want to feel powerful, they want to feel like they have the capability to like do everything. And so the Prophet ﷺ really talks about, not hurting the innocent elements in a war, and, really just, you do what you have to do and you come back, and that's it. So I think it's important to recognize that it's not just to not hurt women and children just generally, but also to protect yourself as well from your, from the ugliness of your human nature.
Right, because it can become, it's very easy to dehumanize, and then from there it's quite a downward spiral into other deviant behaviors that are in the end self-destructive, as you mentioned. So yeah, that is one of the reasons I wanted to discuss this hadith, because it's the idea, warfare for the longest time was the ultimate expression of what is masculine. And so by talking about how the Prophet, peace be upon him, conducted himself during this most masculine of activities, quote unquote, where again the emphasis on gentleness, and even there are hadith and stories about when someone was unarmed, he couldn't be hurt even though he was a combatant, because that was not fair. That didn't go with the justice of conducting war in this way. So I think that speaks a lot to how Muslim men need to view themselves in terms of the broader society. that they should. Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say one thing as you're saying that, and also that, the Prophet did mention like Allah always in war. It was never something personal, like I'm fighting this end because of my own ego. It was always something like I'm doing this for, I'm doing this with the intention of God is with me, and also, almost they really emphasize almost seeking advice from Allah before doing any of these things. And there was always steps. It was never like, okay, we're going to war and that's it. It was always like we need to try to find a solution. We need to try to hash it out, with our words, and then we can, if it becomes an issue of defending ourselves, we only, the wars often happened to defend themselves. And it never was like we're going in there for an occupation. So I think it's important to recognize that even in war, God was a really big part of their internal selves. And they were, even in war, the Prophet constantly asked for Allah to be with them, and for these men to be spiritually in that state of war and not be in that state of war with their ego where they're destructive.
Right. So we always, even in every aspect of our lives, we need to keep that love for Allah, or we need to have that love for Allah in our hearts to keep everything else in check, kind of concept.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, mashallah, we had a ton of beautiful wisdom about what it means to be a Muslim man. And also, perhaps we have hit on anything that you've been struggling with in your life, or perhaps you've just recognized some behaviors that need some fine tuning. As always, Nawal, it's a pleasure to have you. Do you have any last thoughts to leave our listeners with, or?
Not really. I think the only thing I will say is that it's just important to really, as I said again and again, to find a good teacher who can really help you to understand these concepts, because it's really easy to get lost in the fine print of things without understanding the bigger picture. So, Islam is not taking away, it's not saying to be overly masculine in a destructive way, but it's also not taking away your natural human nature of being a man. It's just trying to help you to understand how to adapt into the society in a healthy way, where you're not destructive to others and that you're beneficial to yourself and others.
Right. Well, alhamdulillah, we're always blessed to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, listeners, for joining us. Inshallah, you have garnered some wisdom from the show. Assalamu alaikum.